Here we are at our second part of land and water use, and we are going to focus in on urbanization and ways to mitigate that urbanization or suburbanization, depending on what we're talking about. And so, here are essential knowledge points that we're going to be getting into. Urbanization. So I always like to bring up this iPad, right? Because the impact that people have on the environment, it has to do with the population, affluence, and technology. And so depending on what's happening with each of these things will impact differently. So if your population is big, it's going to have a larger impact. If your affluence is high, you're using a lot of resources, it'll increase your impact. And technology can be one of two ways. Maybe an increase in technology that uses fossil fuels, that's going to increase your impact. If it's technology that's actually mitigating your impact, then it's going to lower the impact. But obviously, the more resources, the more people you have, the more resources they're going to use. More fossil fuels, more building materials, more food. Also, with urbanization comes more affluence, right? So more stuff. And so obviously those are more resources. And so if you look at the amount of vegetation, the amount of water, the amount of wetlands, all of these resources up here, kind of resources, maybe that's the best graph I could find, but you get the drift, right? All of these things are going to decrease with urbanization. The more area I have built up and the more people that are living in one place, the more resources that are going to be used. And the more economic growth you might have, which means that I'm going to use even more. So it could be a cycle. Urbanization affects water. The more people you have, the more water you're going to use. And so especially interesting is wells that are located in coastal areas, and those pump fresh water for our urban centers, which most of our urban centers are on coastal areas, at least here in the United States, if you think about it. But when that happens, you have the possibility of actually pumping salt water into your freshwater supplies. And so that is called saltwater intrusion, and that is not very good. Obviously, we have an influence on the carbon cycle. You have this increase in combustion, of fossil fuels, so increased cars, increased mass transit, even though mass transit is good, right? But right, you have an increase of all of that in an urban center, increase in industry, and so therefore with the combustion of fossil fuels, carbon dioxide will go up. We also generate a lot of waste when we're in a city. I mean, everyone generates a lot of waste, but it's concentrated, right? So you have this increase of trash and landfills. And so when landfills are degrading as they're exposed, it can release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Or at the same time, when they're covered over, they actually turn into methane because there's no oxygen there for the decay. And so instead of creating carbon dioxide, methane, which if you ever go by a landfill, there are these pipes coming out of it like a capped landfill, and they're trapping the methane. Hopefully they're burning it for energy and not just letting it out into the atmosphere, because methane is a very, very, very strong greenhouse gas. In urban centers, we have a lot of impervious surface. So asphalt, buildings, sidewalks, you name it, in an urban center, it's probably not going to allow the infiltration of water. And so you end up with a lot of runoff, so you have a lot of flooding. And then also you have a decrease in groundwater recharge. So obviously your water supplies are going to decrease as well. And finally, people who are in city centers actually have a small footprint because you're building up as opposed to out. But We do build out, right? We have urban sprawl. So this is all part of urbanization, right? Our suburbs here in Stamford are part of the urbanization because we have a city center and we've sprawled outwards, right? The American dream with white picket fence and 2.5 kids and a dog, right? Everybody wants their own little piece of paradise. I mean, of course you do, right? You can blame them. Or maybe you don't, and that's okay too. But anyway, you have this movement outside of urban centers into suburbs and rural areas. And so in doing so, people need to get back into the city. So you have this increased automobile use, more impervious surface because it's not just concentrated in one spot. You have a lot of roads, a lot of driveways, and it just has a larger physical footprint on the land. And then because I like my green lawn, you're watering your lawn, you fertilize your lawn, lots of extra fertilizer going into water, surface water there.
So, one of the ways we can live more sustainably is by reducing our urban runoff. So, we talked about urbanization, and now how do we reduce the amount of runoff that comes from all that impervious surface? And so, really, the answer is to decrease the amount of impervious surface, right? And we can do that through using vegetation, um, by planting trees in cities and also in deforested areas, obviously. But since we're talking about urban runoff, we'll stick to urban trees. So those trees you see along the sidewalks in New York City aren't just because they look pretty, because they do look pretty, right? But also because they help in reducing the amount of runoff that's going into the stormwater system. You also want to increase the number of green spaces. So having parks and whatnot in urban areas is really important. You know, building up and not out and having space left for green instead of paved area. And then, of course, green roofs are also a really great opportunity for water to be taken up instead of letting it run off. And so, with all of the space on top of these buildings, it doesn't have to be pretty, it doesn't have to be functional, it doesn't have to be a walkway, it just has to be vegetated. Of course, it's nice if it's pretty in a walkway and, maybe even a garden, but, let's not get ahead of ourselves here. Another thing that's pretty cool is called permeable pavement. So on the left there, you see that's basically concrete that's permeable to water, so the water can actually get through the pavement and infiltrate down into the soil, recharge that groundwater. Um, Something a little more simple in the middle there are just pavers with gravel that are big enough to have a high infiltration rate. And then, of course, you can also have grass pavers. So these pavers that allow, um, space to natural space underneath it. Another way to reduce urban runoff is, like I said before, building up, not out. So building high rises, like high rises, instead of, 3 floors or even 10 floors, you're looking at, 20s, 30s, 40s, hundreds, and so you have fit the same amount of people in one physical footprint than in an individual house. And think about that many people spread out over the landscape. And so your actual physical footprint is less building up. And then, of course, if people take public transportation and you have a really good public transportation system, you don't need as many roadways because not so many people are coming in their individual cars, right? You have more mass transit, whether it's buses or trains, right? All of those are maximizing the roads and reduces the need to make more roads.